Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a long, unflinching look into the justice systems of medieval and early modern Europe. Our mission is to move beyond the general history of torture and execution. We want to dive into the specific, calculated mechanics of cruelty. These instruments designed not just to punish a thief, but to permanently rewrite their entire identity.
Exactly. We're not talking about quick, merciful ends here. We're looking at devices that were engineered to ensure that if you survived, your own body became the walking, visible criminal record. And that record would follow you for the rest of your, frankly, much shorter life.
Right. And we've pulled a lot of material for this. Historical transcripts, court records, even some executioners' journals. The goal is to understand the human cost and, maybe more importantly, the systemic injustice that allowed the innocent to be crushed with the same cold efficiency as the guilty.
And it's so important to remember these were highly localized, highly theatrical forms of justice. They weren't just laws written in a book, they were public performances. Performances designed to instill terror and, reinforce the social order. When you really scrutinize the mechanisms, the cruelty feels less random and much more calculated. It's total, irreversible social destruction, all wrapped up in the language of righteousness.
And we're going to start with the device that, in its insidious simplicity, perhaps best encapsulates this horror, the hand press.
Yeah.
Just the very concept of this tool to deliberately, methodically destroy a person's life and identity. That's the dark hook that draws us into this deep dive. So let's unpack the anatomy of this suffering. So our sources, they describe the hand press in archives all across Europe, German lands, France, the Low Countries. And the one thing that's always the same is its deceptive simplicity. It looked, for all the world, like a bulky tool you'd find in a blacksmith shop.
Absolutely. Essentially just two heavy iron plates, maybe 10 inches wide, connected by this massive central screw mechanism. You could walk right past it in a marketplace and just assume it was for, I don't know, bending horseshoes or something.
That banality is part of what makes it so terrifying.
It is. It's an efficient piece of engineering, but its only job was to exert maximal focused pressure. It didn't need to be complex because its function was just compression. Pure, brutal compression.
And this basic design, it transcended borders. It was like a universal language of suffering. What were some of the regional names for it?
Well, in German lands, it was often called the Dolmen. Sometimes the Daumenschraube, the thumbscrew, if they were using a smaller version. But the big hand press was for theft. In France, you might hear it called le mât, literally, the handbreaker, or sometimes the pildois, the finger pillory. But whatever the name, the design was uniform. The purpose was absolute, irreversible destruction, to make sure a thief could never again earn an honest living with their hands.
And the setting for this punishment was never an accident, was it? It was pure, calculated theater.
Never. It was always chosen to maximize the audience and the emotional impact. The condemned would be brought to a platform, usually a raised wooden stage, on market day, when the town was absolutely thronged with people.
Or even on a Sunday, right after church.
Right, which is even more cynical. The community had just received divine guidance, and now they were about to witness the application of earthly civic morality. It was a required spectacle you were expected to watch.
Which brings us to the central figure in all this, the executioner. A very contradictory role.
A profoundly contradictory one. He was a professional. Often he inherited the position from his father or an uncle, and he was absolutely essential for maintaining civic order. But at the same time, he was completely shunned, lived on the outskirts of town, forbidden from normal social interaction. No one would drink from the same well as him. No one would share a pew in church.
And yet, our sources show he was often a highly paid specialist.
Oh, yes. Often paid better than the town baker or the blacksmith. His skills were rare and in constant demand, and that tells you a tremendous amount about the values of the society. They hated the man's task, but they valued the result order so highly that they were willing to pay a high price for that specialized labor of cruelty.
A morbid kind of skill.
A very morbid skill. He had to be skilled enough to inflict the maximum amount of pain and permanent injury without accidentally killing the victim too quickly. That would defeat the whole purpose.
So the thief's hand is placed between those iron plates. The performance begins.
And it begins with the slow turn. The executioner would use a massive iron bar for leverage, and he'd start turning the screw. At first, it's just pressure, the slow, dawning realization of what's about to happen. Your primal instinct is to pull back, of course.
But you can't.
You can't. The sources are very clear on this. There were always two strong guards holding the victim by the arms and shoulders, zero possibility of escape. You couldn't even flinch away. You were held immobile, forced to endure it. Often the condemned would just look at the executioner, pleading for speed or mercy, but they would be met with this blank face of a functionary doing his job.
Let's get into the anatomy of the destruction.
Yeah.
A human hand has 27 small bones. It's a miracle of engineering. How did this device specifically target and destroy that function?
It's a question of structural vulnerability. The metacarpals, those 5 long bones that form your palm, they were the first to go. The accounts describe the sound not as a singular snap, but as a deep, sickening splintering, a long, agonizing series of microfractures as the bone just gives up against the compression. That shockwave would travel right up the arm.
And then the fingers.
Then the phalanges, the finger bones, they're much smaller, more delicate. They didn't just break, they shattered. The pressure would drive fragment against fragment. One account describes it as sounding like gravel being crushed under a heavy wooden wheel.
Wow.
Yeah. And the ligaments holding it all together, they just snapped like wet rope. Cartilage was just pulverized. The goal was total structural integrity loss, not just a clean break.
It was deliberately slow.
Oh, absolutely. The executioner would pause, maybe every quarter turn of the screw. He'd check the damage, feel the resistance, listen to the sounds of the crushing. This wasn't about getting it over with. It was about deterrence. The victim had to feel every single stage of agony. And the massive crowd, they needed to witness the full, terrible consequence.
The crowd. Right, they were essential to the whole process.
The initial noise of the market, the shouting, the vendors, it would just die down to this absolute eerie silence when the screw started to turn. People were transfixed. It's hard for us to grasp now, but historical records confirm that children were routinely hoisted onto their father's shoulders to get a better view.
They saw it as education.
As essential civic education, a harsh lesson in social boundaries.
And the result on the hand was immediate.
Immediate and visible. The hand would just swell grotesquely. It would transform into this unrecognizable, purple, bulging mass. One source describes it as looking like spoiled, freshly butchered meat. It just lost all semblance of being a human hand, and the pain would be all-consuming. It just overwhelms your senses, reduces the victim to screams, or sometimes just a terrified silence.
What if they passed out from the shock?
Unacceptable. The spectacle required the victim's conscious participation. Vomiting, thrashing, biting their own tongues, that was all common. But if they fainted, buckets of cold, often filthy water were thrown in their face, sometimes mixed with salt to shock them back to consciousness. Mercy was denied utterly. The deterrence value relied on the subject being fully aware of their own suffering.
That denial of unconsciousness, it really underscores the state's purpose, doesn't it? It wasn't just to punish the theft.
No, it was to enforce psychological compliance among everyone watching. By forcing the victim to endure that full measure of pain, the state was sending a clear message. We control your pain. We control your consciousness. And we control your future.
So the device is open, the damage is done. But that's not the end of the sentence. It's really just the beginning.
That's the permanent punishment. The hand would be this mass of permanently misaligned, splintered bone. A doctor or a barber surgeon was sometimes present, but again, not to help. They were there to make sure the victim didn't die immediately from shock or blood loss, because immediate death, again, ruined the deterrent effect. They were meant to live.
And the treatment for this injury?
Well, treatment is a generous word. The hand was typically bandaged with whatever was available, usually dirty, rough linen, so you've got guaranteed contamination and severe infection. Assuming they survived that, and many didn't, the long-term prognosis was grim. The hand would heal locked in that crushed, fixed position. Fingers fused together, palm rigid, you couldn't grasp anything. A tool, a rope, piece of bread.
It was economic assassination.
Completely. For a society that relied on manual labor, this was the end of your ability to provide for yourself. You struggled to eat, to dress, to do the most basic things.
And you mentioned that winter often completed the sentence.
Yes. The statistics from some of these German towns are chilling. Victims of the hand press had significantly shorter lifespans, and a disproportionate number died during the first severe winter after their punishment. It wasn't the injury itself that killed them. It was the inability to grip an axe to chop firewood or to properly wrap a heavy cloak around themselves to stay warm. The punishment ensured they couldn't prepare for survival.
So the destroyed hand, it became their permanent criminal record, a walking warning.
It was an inescapable mark, Before official identity documents, your body was the record. Every shopkeeper, every potential employer, every person in the community could instantly read the story written in your scar tissue and your crooked fingers. You were shunned, unemployable, often forced into begging, perpetually on the fringes of society, living only to serve as a silent, miserable example to others.
The hand press was this ultimate tool of mechanical destruction. But looking across Europe, we see this whole orchestra of suffering. Each region had its own variation designed to maximize a specific kind of pain or shame.
It's fascinating, isn't it? How different societies prioritize different vectors of control. Some, like in England, prioritized collective rage. Others prioritized the absolute loss of function. And others, like in France, prioritized deep, inescapable shame.
So let's look at that public shame, that violence embodied in the pillory, especially in London. Locking someone's head and hands in a wooden frame might sound less destructive than the press, but its cruelty was communal.
That's exactly right. The pillory made the victim absolutely vulnerable to the collective rage of the street. And that rage wasn't just incidental, it was formalized as an extension of justice. The community was tacitly tasked with administering the punishment. This let the authorities maintain this, veneer of legality while externalizing the brutality to the ordinary citizen.
And they would throw anything.
Anything available. Rotten vegetables could cause blunt trauma. Rotten eggs were dangerous in these crowded, unsanitary cities. They carried disease. But the real danger was from people throwing harder objects, rocks, paving stones, bricks.
And we have the specific chilling case of Thomas Brewster from 1731.
Yes, Thomas Brewster's case from the Old Bailey records is just a stark reminder of the cost of minor theft. His crime. He stole a handkerchief, a small piece of linen worth only 3 shillings. For that, he spent 3 hours in the pillory. By the time he was released, the crowd had broken his nose, knocked out 4 of his teeth, and left one eye swollen completely shut. The tragedy is he died 2 weeks later, not from the initial trauma, but from the severe infection that raged through the cuts on his face. Justice was served by the mob's enthusiasm.
And it wasn't just injuries. Sometimes the crowd unintentionally suffocated the victims.
Yes, in cases where the crowd was particularly frenzied, the physical force of the mob pressing against the platform itself became lethal. There are records from 1756 in London of an incident where 4 people in the pillory died. They weren't killed by things being thrown. They died from compressive asphyxiation. The crowd pressed so tightly against the platform that the victims, locked in place, couldn't expand their chests to breathe. They were just crushed to death by the weight of their angry neighbors. Utterly helpless.
Okay, let's move to the German lands. A different focus here. Tearing the flesh, not breaking bone. The device known as the cat's paw.
The cat's paw was a truly vicious instrument. Imagine a metal rake, but with 4 or 5 extremely sharp, curved claws attached to a long wooden handle. It was used mainly for thieves, but also for vagrants, sometimes for petty fraud.
And the procedure itself.
The victim would be stripped to the waist and tied rigidly to a post. Then the executioner, and this, again, required immense skill, would dig the claws into the victim's flesh near the shoulder. He'd then drag the device downward with immense pressure, creating these 4 parallel tracks down to the waist. The goal was to remove long strips of skin and muscle tissue without penetrating deep enough to sever a major artery. A clean death would have been a failure.
I can't imagine the sound.
The records describe it, the wet, tearing sound of tissue separating, as notoriously sickening, even for seasoned spectators. And once the lacerations were complete, they were immediately cauterized.
With a hot iron.
A glowing hot iron, yes. The executioner's assistant would apply it to the wounds to seal them, stop the bleeding, and sear the exposed nerves. The smell of burning flesh would have filled the market square. Survivors were left with backs of twisted, shiny scar tissue. They couldn't wear rough clothing or lie flat comfortably for the rest of their lives. An instant visible mark.
Contrast that with the French method. Branding. The fleur-de-lis applied to the shoulder.
French justice was all about creating an inescapable social stigma. The iron was heated orange hot, it was maybe 3 inches across, and the burn itself was quick, a violent hiss, a puff of smoke. But the placement was key. It was deliberately put on the shoulder where it would be visible under many common garments, especially when you're working or reaching.
So the physical pain was temporary, but the social pain was forever.
Exactly. Even after the wound healed, that scar tissue was undeniable. Bathhouses, inns, many businesses would refuse entry to anyone with the mark. For a woman, marriage prospects just vanished, and any attempt to remove it by cutting it out or burning over it just led to worse infections or these mangled scars that drew even more attention.
In the Italian city-states like Venice, It was even more direct for repeat offenders.
Yeah.
Amputation.
The Venetian and Florentine approach was pure functional removal. Your first theft, you get branded. Your second theft, you lose the means to steal. And this was not a sterile medical procedure.
It was an axe on a chopping block.
Exactly. The same chopping block often used for butcher work, already stained and filthy. The executioner would aim for the wrist joint. And reports indicate that if he was inexperienced, it might take 2 or 3 agonizing strikes.
And then sealing the wound.
Then came the barbaric necessity of sealing the wound. The freshly severed stump was immediately plunged into a vat of boiling tar. It was the only effective way they had to cauterize it and stop the person from bleeding to death. The agony of having raw, severed nerves submerged in superheated tar is, well, it's unimaginable.
The story of Giacomo in Venice is a heartbreaking illustration of this system.
It is. In 1492, Giacomo lost his right hand for stealing candlesticks. Just 2 years later, driven by starvation, he stole food and lost his left hand. The system had successfully rendered him incapable of theft, but also incapable of self-sufficiency. He was found frozen to death in an alley in 1495. These victims became tragic, mobile warnings for the city.
And there were also these highly psychological methods, like ear nailing, where the torture was the standoff.
Ear nailing was a public display of forced humility. A thief's ear was nailed tightly to a wooden post in the market square. The physical pain of the nail was actually secondary to the mental torture of being forced to stand perfectly still all day, from sunrise to sunset. You can't move your head without tearing your own flesh, all while enduring lectures, spit, and poking from everyone walking by.
And then the final act was this devastating choice.
At the end of the day, you had to choose. You could tear yourself free, which would leave this ragged, mutilated ear that would heal into an unmistakable mark. Or you could wait for the executioner, who often just took the entire ear off anyway to make sure the marker was clear. A missing ear was a badge of shame you wore forever.
And finally, for crimes against the ultimate authority, the Church, the Spanish Inquisition, used the strapardo.
Yes, especially for sacrilege, or theft of church property. This one relied purely on the body's own biomechanics to induce agony. It was a pulley system. They'd tie your hands behind your back, forcing your arms into this unnatural position. Then they'd hoist you high into the air. Your full body weight hanging from your arms would instantly and violently dislocate both your shoulder joints. You'd hear this terrifying pop that the crowd could hear.
Just the dislocation itself would be agonizing.
Overwhelming. And to compound the damage, they would sometimes drop the victim suddenly, stopping the rope just short of the ground. That violent jerk would shred ligaments, damage nerve bundles, and guarantee permanent systemic damage. Survivors were often left with arms that just hung uselessly below their waist. They couldn't lift them. It created this distinctive, hunched posture that marked them forever.
So the level of cruelty was clearly proportional to the economic threat. A stolen handkerchief gets you the pillory, but stealing a horse, that warranted a punishment of maximum prolonged agony.
A horse was seen through a completely different lens. It wasn't just property, it was immense capital. You needed it for agriculture, for transport, and critically, for military readiness, for status. Stealing a horse was perceived almost as an act of treason against the entire economic order of the town.
So the punishment had to be equally severe. In England, this meant hanging, but a very specific kind of hanging.
Right. This wasn't the swift, neck-breaking drop that became standardized later. A quick death was considered far too merciful. The execution was done by placing the condemned in a cart beneath the gallows, putting the noose around their neck, and then simply driving the cart away. This resulted in death by slow strangulation, asphyxiation.
And it was deliberately drawn out.
Intentionally. 5, 10, sometimes even 15 minutes of struggle. And to really maximize the spectacle, the executioner often left the victim's hands untied. This was so the crowd could watch the desperate, agonizing clawing at the rope, turning the struggle for life into community entertainment and a chilling, visceral lesson.
The physiological details of this are often in the executioner's reports.
They're graphic. The face turning from red to a terrifying purple, the eyes bulging, the tongue protruding, the entire process of oxygen deprivation laid bare for the public. The death throes themselves became the central, prolonged moment of community focus. It was meant to terrorize any potential thief.
And the punishment didn't end with death. The post-mortem display was an extension of that terror.
Oh, the bodies were often left hanging for days, weeks even. They would bloat in the sun, attract scavenging birds until the authorities decided the message had been thoroughly absorbed. This wasn't just about disposal, it was about maximizing the return on investment of the execution.
Which culminates in the most absolute form of permanent warning, the gibbets.
Yes. In many regions, the corpse was secured in a metal cage, the gibbet. It was designed to hold the decomposing body together even as the flesh decayed and the bones separated. These cages were then erected at strategic locations, crossroads, entrances to cities, high on prominent hills. They became these permanent skeletal monuments to consequence, visible for miles. A rattling, decomposing figure serving as a constant symbol that the system's reach was absolute, extending even beyond the grave.
All of this calculated brutality,
Mm.
these permanent markings, this public terror, it's all made exponentially more horrific when you realize the fatal flaw at the heart of the system, the overwhelming priority of speed over accuracy.
And that is the core tragedy of medieval justice. The mechanisms were built to operate with incredible speed. If a wealthy merchant claimed his goods were stolen and pointed at a poor, marginalized person, a vagrant, a stranger, the conviction and punishment could happen within hours.
So due process as we understand it, investigation, defense, appeal, it just didn't exist in any meaningful way for the poor.
Not at all. There was no investigation beyond the accuser's word, there was no defense attorney, and crucially, no presumption of innocence. The system was based on a simple, summary justice model: maintain order through swift retribution. The speed was everything. A trial might last less than an hour, sometimes just minutes of shouted accusations and denials. If you were poor, a stranger, or you lacked character witnesses with enough status, conviction was almost guaranteed.
Which means that the whole machinery of mutilation, the press, the brand, the axe, was applied with terrifying certainty to the potentially innocent.
That is the cruelest irony. They prioritized quick punishment because they believed it was the only way to maintain civic stability. But in prioritizing speed, they systematically sacrificed the truth. The efficiency with which the guilty were mutilated was matched only by the efficiency with which innocent lives were irrevocably destroyed.
And underpinning all of this was the logic of the ordeal, the belief that God would intervene for the innocent.
It was a circular, self-serving logic. If you are suffering, you must deserve it. If you were truly innocent, God would miraculously stop the screw from turning, or your wound would heal without infection. So if you bled and screamed and healed with a crippled hand, your guilt was divinely sanctioned.
But the reality is that the tools themselves are indifferent to morality.
Exactly. The hand press crushes bone, whether you're guilty or innocent. The brand burns innocent flesh just as hot as criminal flesh. The gallows rope strangles the wrongly accused just as definitively as the actual criminal. The mechanism of cruelty performs its function without moral judgment, creating deep, lasting injustice under the very mantle of law and order. To really grasp this, we have to look at the names in the archives. The men and women whose innocence was later proven, often far too late, and whose lives were utterly decimated by that systemic certainty. Let's start by delving deeper into the devastation of Hans the Miller in 1487.
Hans was a working miller, accused by a powerful landowner of stealing grain. He insisted he'd bought it, but he didn't have a receipt.
A common problem. But his word was weighed against a powerful man's accusation. So Hans was swiftly convicted. His right hand, the hand crucial for his trade, went into the press that Tuesday morning. The community witnessed the destruction of his ability to work.
And the truth came out just 2 weeks later.
2 weeks. The actual thief, a vagrant, was caught trying to sell the grain and confessed fully. The record was clear. Hans was innocent.
So what was the official response to Hans, who is now permanently disabled?
Their response was chilling in its bureaucratic callousness. Hans received no compensation, no apology, no public declaration of his innocence. The official magistrate's record just stated that the case was unfortunate, but the process was followed correctly. The system was more concerned with justifying its own procedures than with repairing a human life.
And Hans's life was destroyed.
Functionally destroyed. He lost his mill, his home. He became a beggar, relying on charity in a community that still saw him as a marked man. He struggled to survive for 2 more years and died frozen in a ditch in the winter of 1489, a death delivered by poverty and incapacity, directly caused by the court's error.
The same pattern repeats for Catherine the seamstress in Lyon, 1532.
Catherine was accused of stealing silk from a prominent merchant. She denied it, but his word was indisputable in the eyes of the court. She was branded with the fleur-de-lis. As a seamstress, her livelihood depended entirely on trust and reputation. She lost every customer, was evicted from her apartment, abandoned by her social circle. She was rendered completely unemployable.
And her innocence was confirmed 3 years later.
3 years later, another woman was caught and confessed to the crime Catherine was blamed for. The court finally acknowledged her innocence, her official pardon, a note in a ledger. An unfortunate mistake was entered into the record. There was no attempt to remove the brand, no compensation. The only work she could find was in a brothel. She died 6 years after being branded from disease.
And the story of Friedrich in Nuremberg shows how long an injustice could stand.
Friedrich was an honest worker for a goldsmith for 7 years. He was accused of stealing gold by the goldsmith's son. The son was believed. Friedrich's hand was crushed. Friedrich lived for 7 more years as a marked beggar, dying in poverty in 1452. 15 years after the verdict, the goldsmith's son, on his deathbed, confessed. He had stolen the gold and blamed Friedrich.
15 years later.
Yes. And the authorities officially recorded the pardon of Friedrich, acknowledging his innocence. But Friedrich had been dead for 8 years. He died impoverished and condemned for a crime he never committed, and his children suffered the stigma their whole lives.
We also have to talk about the children who were victims. The age of criminal responsibility was devastatingly low.
As young as 7 years old in England.
Which brings us to the horrifying case of Thomas in 1629. An 8-year-old boy hanged.
His crime was stealing a single loaf of bread to feed his starving, ill family. The baker demanded prosecution, and the court, bound by statutes that prioritized property rights over compassion, sentenced an 8-year-old boy to death. The system just ground forward. The law required retribution, and the compassion we would demand today was wholly absent.
And women were especially vulnerable to false accusations.
Absolutely. They lacked the status or influence to summon strong character witnesses. They could be accused out of spite, professional jealousy. The evidence could be ludicrously thin, yet it was enough. Take Margaret in 1687, branded for stealing a chicken her neighbor's daughter had actually eaten. 6 months later, the daughter confessed. But Margaret had already been branded, lost her job, and been forced out of the community. The system was designed to act quickly based on an accuser's certainty. It was never designed to seek the truth. #outro.
This deep dive has shown us a world where the instruments of punishment were not just tools of pain, but tools of absolute social and economic destruction. The hand press, the cat's paw, the gibbets, they all served multiple functions: retribution, brutal deterrence, public entertainment, and maybe most of all, social control.
And the physical marks left on Hans and Catherine and so many others, they were meticulously engineered. They were designed to ensure the victims could never fully reintegrate, never escape their past. They had to remain as visible breathing warnings. The goal was the total destruction of the life after the judgment.
And the true horror, as we've seen, lies not in the devices themselves, but in the certainty with which they were applied. Medieval society saw itself as civilized. They saw their system as righteous and necessary for order. They never seemed to question whether crushing the hands of potentially innocent people undermined the very justice they claimed to serve.
They believed their mechanisms were infallible because they trusted status and speed over truth and process, and that certainty is what created the systemic injustice.
If history teaches us anything from these bloody records, it's that certainty and justice are rarely the same thing.
So we want to leave you with this final thought to consider. We've abolished the hand press and the pillory, but what mechanisms exist in our own modern world to prevent the destruction of an innocent person's life? We no longer use physical branding, but do we still value the efficiency and finality of quick processes over the sometimes messy search for truth? We have to ask ourselves, are we truly learning from the certainty-driven mistakes of the past, or have we simply exchanged the iron press for subtler, slower, but maybe equally life-destroying tools of systemic error?